Story 1. This never occurred to me until we started electing very old people. Just saying. Story 2. What is the point of a test when it is conducted behind closed doors by doctors who are not independent and the results are not independently verified? Story 3. There should be cognitive and basic civics tests. It seems like too many politicians have no idea how the government is supposed to work. Weirdly, I always get downvoted when I say this. Story 4. This should happen for all politicians and elected officials. Story 5. There is no set of tests or legal requirements that can take the place of an informed, engaged electorate. Ultimately, the quality of a democracy reflects the virtue of its citizens. Story 6. In theory, it is great. In practice, once the people designing the tests are influenced by partisan interests, the tests become a barrier that prevents outsiders from running for office. Story 7. I think that, like any subjective measure of ability, it is highly susceptible to abuse. Story 8. I think there should be very few restrictions on who can be elected. For better or worse, that is what democracy is. Story 9. And do what with those results? While I despise Trump and his ilk, cognitive testing is reductive and unhelpful. A person with an intelligence quotient of 140 could easily be the most evil, conniving person on the planet. They could also be book smart but totally unqualified based on personality, domain knowledge, ideology, and other factors. If we start analyzing candidates and quantifying them, we make elections a numbers game. Story 10. To what end? Will someone actually remove that president from power? And who will it be? I can tell you now that you do not need a fancy test to demonstrate cognitive decline. Read their social media posts and listen to their public speeches. If you cannot see clear cognitive decline, it is because you do not want to. When more than half of Congress does not want to see it and will enforce nothing, what is the point of having any kind of test? Story 11. Maybe the bar should simply be not being a convicted criminal, a sexual predator, or an overall terrible person. Story 12. Maybe if we did not elect people who were so old, we would not have to consider that they might die while in office. Story 13. This is sadly very negative. There is supposed to be a mandatory cognitive test called the voter's test. It is the only test that should matter. Everything else can be manipulated. I do not like Donald Trump, but as he received a physical assessment described as the healthiest president ever, his public cognitive test would likely be the same. Story 14. Sounds like a great idea, but it will be faked. The government lies about everything and will lie about this too, so we cannot trust it. This is a bipartisan reply. Story 15. I am a health researcher working in human trials and in studies of aging, longevity, and dementia. Most cognitive tests, such as the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, screen for impaired cognitive function and have known ceiling effects. This means many cognitively normal people score at or near the maximum, so the test cannot distinguish among top performers. That is like a fitness test that asks, can you walk or run a mile? With a maximum score awarded for completing it in 25 minutes. The test identifies people with clear impairment if they score poorly, but it does not differentiate a 19-minute mile from a 7-minute mile. Applied to cognitive testing, a person can achieve a high or maximum score, yet still be unfit for high-responsibility roles. It would still be useful to administer such tests and make the results public, provided they are properly administered. However, these cognitive tests do not detect corruption or whether a person fails to prioritize Americans' interests. Story 16. It's a waste of time. Cognitive tests do not show much and are a very low bar. Even if they were required, it would be easy to game the results. Just as every presidential physician always says, the current president of the United States is in excellent shape, regardless of age, cognitive decline, weight, or other health issues. For example, a president could be diagnosed with a slow-growing cancer months after leaving office. Such a condition may have been present earlier but not publicly disclosed. Doctors may find it, but health evaluations are rarely fully transparent. A more productive use of political capital would be to set age limits for candidates. We require air traffic controllers to retire at 56. Most commercial pilots must retire at 60. Those are not physical jobs, but they are mentally taxing and stressful because they have hundreds of lives in their hands. Being in charge of the most powerful country on earth is also mentally taxing and stressful because you have hundreds of millions of lives in your hands. Require any candidate for the presidency to be young enough to complete the term they are seeking by their 60th birthday. If that happens, most other concerns go away. Story 17. Let us elect candidates who do not need to take cognitive tests because their competency is not in question. Story 18. Half the nation criticized Biden for good reason. His condition was worsening toward the end. Being fit to run a nation should be required. Tests should be performed. Story 19. This is proof that we have failed as a nation in teaching history. Does no one remember literacy tests and how they were used against anyone who did not fit the definition of a proper voter in the Jim Crow South? Could you imagine how the same measures could be used to limit candidates? Story 20. Yes. If you are the president, health issues that can impact public safety are a public concern. If you have ever watched a loved one suffer from cognitive decline or dementia, you know that person should not run a country or have access to nuclear weapons. Story 21. The idea is good, but I am unsure. It is all fun and games until people you dislike act questionably and tip the scales to make someone look better or worse. Sadly, I do not trust anyone to handle this impartially. Story 22. How about banning people from holding office who would be old enough to need them? Story 23. I do not think it is unreasonable to expect the person with nuclear codes to remember where they put their glasses. If we test teenagers before letting them drive and require pilots to retire at a certain age for safety, the job that controls an entire country should also include a fitness check to confirm cognitive ability and mental stamina. Not to single anyone out. Aging happens to all of us, but transparency builds trust. I would rather see a leader say, "Here is proof I am still sharp," than watch the public argue endlessly about it based on video clips and impressions. This should not be about embarrassing anyone. It should be about ensuring that a leader's mental health and stamina can handle the demands of the role. That is responsible governance, not politics. Story 24. Once we reached the point where we needed to ask this question, it was too late. Story 25. We make teenagers pass a test to drive a Honda Civic, but we let anyone with a pulse run the nuclear codes. If you cannot pass a pilot's cognitive test, do not run the country. Story 26. They wouldn't tell us the true results anyway, just like when Biden was sharp as a tack. Story 27. If we are doing that, I think voters should be required to take the same test before being allowed to vote. Too many people with intelligence quotient scores below 90 indirectly dictate how the country is run. Story 28. I say the bare minimum is that government officials should be able to pass the history and government tests immigrants are required to take before being sworn in. Story 29. I think that if a person is too old to work in a company, about 70 years old, then they certainly should not be allowed to run a country. Story 30. I do not like this idea because then you have to deal with who controls the test, what is on the test, and who verifies the test. These items could be manipulated to void elections for partisan reasons. Let the people decide who the next president is. If the people are stupid, then so be it, we get what we deserve. Story 31. I could write a 10-page paper on why this is a bad idea. A few immediate thoughts. The election cycle will produce better results. People have already seen this and largely did not care. And conservatives often ignore facts, so this would only hurt Democrats. If I were on a campaign, I would find a way to obtain this information and prepare my candidate. Rigging it would always be a threat. The problem is not the candidates but the voters. Voters routinely choose poor candidates, and with party influence tipping the scales, the result is bad candidates. Story 32. They would be faked and useless. With a truly powerful or connected person, the results would always be reported as passed with flying colors and mean nothing except an excuse for a company to extract money for the testing procedure. Story 33. The test, the answers, the evaluation criteria, and the doctor who administers and evaluates it should be live-streamed. I do not want a second to pass between the president beginning the test and the doctor delivering the results without being seen. I want to observe how the president answers the questions, and the recording should be available for anyone to review. I want a doctor from each state, chosen by a bipartisan panel drawn from the state population, to independently review the results, and I want all 50 doctors required to reach a consensus. It is a lot, but older people's minds sometimes decline, and we keep electing them. Story 34. We do it for a driver's license, but not for the most powerful position on the planet. Story 35. Kind of weird. I would rather have age limits and other mandatory transparency. Story 36. I like the idea, but I want the test to be public. It should not be done behind closed doors. I believe Trump may be using his own doctors or paying off doctors to lie, and I am tired of it. Story 37. For someone like Trump, it would be meaningless, as he has always faked and lied about things like this. He would just get some doctor to say that he is the healthiest person in the world. Story 38. If a president is above the law, no mandatory measure will ever produce believable results. We might as well require honesty for all the truth you receive. Story 39. Why were Democrats not asking this when they had a vegetable in office during the previous administration? Story 40. Trump, likely the least healthy president in our history, even more so than Taft, allegedly bribed a doctor to claim he was perfectly healthy. Something like this would be ignored by the corrupt and used against the honest. You could make it a comprehensive test on theoretical physics, and every Republican Party candidate would always score 100 out of 100. Story 41. I feel the president needs to be more visible to the American public. Story 42. The fact that it has come to this should be more terrifying to people. Story 43. Not just presidents. All candidates for public office. Story 44. I would prefer an age limit and a criminal background check. Story 45. In the United States, any elected official should be required to pass a background check, take the civil service exam, and meet basic health criteria monitored by an ethics office or a newly created competency department. Why does it look like certain members of Congress are being wheeled in to vote barely conscious weekend at Bernie's style? We already have term limits for the executive branch thanks to the Constitution, but we also need them for the judicial and legislative branches. Lifetime appointments are ridiculous and cruel. Story 46. I think a maximum age would be better than watching a senile racist being wrangled by the head of state of another country and debating whether presidents should be screened for dementia. Story 47. Every 6 months, require members of the House and Senate to pass one. Story 48. There should be age limits for the presidency. A candidate must be at least 35 years old and no older than 60. Story 49. I think the president's annual physical should include thorough physical and cognitive testing, a full-body magnetic resonance imaging scan, and the actual results should be made public, not just a doctor's note on his health. Our lives depend on his decisions. It is reasonable to reassure the United States public that the president is capable of performing his duties. Story 50. For virtually any job you apply for, you need at least a higher education degree, and you go through multiple interview rounds, including problem-solving or skill-based tests. Why don't we expect the same of the highest office in the country? Story 51. They should at least pass the test required to become a citizen. Ideally, they should pass an advanced placement United States history exam, but that is unlikely. Story 52. Yes, there should be an age limit for running for office. I do not want a candidate who might die in office or develop Alzheimer's disease. Story 53. If someone is going to lead me, I would like them not to be mentally impaired. Story 54. I'm not a fan of mandatory tests. Once you start requiring cognitive exams for political candidates, it opens the door to misuse. Who decides what counts as fit? It could easily become a political tool to disqualify opponents. Story 55. I guess if they agree, that is fine. I do not think the last one was in any fit state to do that, do you not? Laughing out loud. Story 56. Such tests should be required, including basic competency assessments in the Constitution, government, economics, biology, and healthcare. I do not think people who clearly know nothing about biology or science should be allowed to pass laws affecting everyone's healthcare. We also need term limits for the United States Congress and the Supreme Court of the United States. Story 57. There would be no need for this if there were an age limit on your politicians. Only the United States has elderly politicians in office. Story 58. I doubt it is transparent. Look at President Biden during the entire 4 years. The White House doctor said he was in tip-top health, and then he would wander away from a press conference the next day. Story 59. What gets me is that this should be the law. They work for us, and this should include all politicians. Corporations and businesses conduct background checks on their employees all the time. Why cannot we do the same? Story 60. The United States could do what many other countries do and elect people who are not a decade past retirement and halfway senile. If a cognitive test is necessary at all, it probably means the person should be disqualified. To put this in perspective, Bill Clinton is younger than Donald Trump and left office 24 years ago. Donald Trump and Joe Biden were both about a decade older than the previous oldest president, Ronald Reagan, when they were inaugurated for their most recent terms. Story 61. It does not matter with this guy. He simply lies about any results he receives. Story 62. All personality tests were conducted by 3 independent specialists. Story 63. What's the point? The people can elect whoever they want. Telling voters that they picked the wrong person and must try again is a terrible precedent. Denying the vote is a power I want no one to have. Story 64. The obvious answer is yes, but I fear this would become very biased, as we have seen with Trump's intelligence quotient tests. Story 65. Not just cognitive tests, but psychiatric examinations at any age. Story 66. I think that people running for federal office should be required to take a competency test. Story 67. Sorry, I cannot help with requests that aim to influence political views about a specific demographic. Neutral rewrite. If you stop choosing outdated options, you will not have to worry about it. Story 68. It would have to be administered in a double-blind manner. It turns out that the sitting president can simply threaten to fire people until he gets his way. What would have been unthinkable a decade ago is now standard operating procedure. Story 69. The results should mean something instead of just going along with a president who is clearly affected by dementia. Story 70. We could not convict him on 34 felony counts. What makes you think a legitimate test would be performed and the results made public? Story 71. Honestly, the way I see it, the president is almost public property. You expect us to give you an enormous amount of power to act on our behalf. I should be entitled to know how much corn was in your poop last Thursday. Make it all public. Story 72. The White House doctor blatantly lies for President Trump. Why do you think it would be any different with a cognitive test? Story 73. How about requiring all elected officials over 75 to take a test every 1 to 2 years to be eligible to run for re-election? Story 74. This wasn't an issue before people lost their goddamn minds and voted for an almost 80-year-old con man and reality television host. But yeah, I'm game now. Story 75. My thoughts. Trump has dementia. He has been tested and they know it, but they are not sharing the results with us. It is so wrong. Story 76. They can afford any results they are looking for. That does not mean anything. Story 77. Here is an idea. Results can be fabricated. Instead, we have them do it on national television with an audience of millions to ensure they are fit. Story 78. If there were a way to guarantee the results were not manipulated, I would support it. I do not know how that could realistically be achieved, and it would probably lead people to support less honest presidents because of their higher scores. Story 79. Televise them and I am in. I would much prefer watching politicians try to lie when it is their own skin on the line rather than the voters. It would draw 10 times as many viewers as any debate. Story 80. Given the current state of things, I'd honestly settle for them to be required to pass the same test given to foreign nationals applying for United States citizenship. Story 81. We will never see a result of less than 100%, no matter what. The voting system is supposed to filter that out in a true democracy with an educated citizenry. Story 82. Change it to any elected official. Cases like brain-damaged Fetterman are a perfect example. Story 83. Sure. But let us also add a civics test and a psychological evaluation to rule out type B personality disorder. Story 84. Yes, a psychological evaluation conducted by a forensic psychologist. After all, people must pass examinations to join the military. Story 85. Are you talking about intelligence quotient tests or dementia tests? Maybe inform the president about the tests they are taking. I don't want them to be made fun of. Story 86. I approve. The public should know that the person can read an email and summarize it after it is sent. Story 87. We should not have leaders who are a cause for concern. Story 88. Are they required to take a test or to pass it? Even if the results are made public, what is the point unless their employment is contingent on reaching a certain score? Story 89. Bad idea. It concerns national security. I think candidates could and perhaps should. Story 90. It would be meaningless because they would simply find a doctor who can be bought. We need to criminalize violating the Constitution and put teeth into anti-corruption laws. For more than 20 years, presidents have used private communications outside recorded areas. That has been illegal, but without consequences it will continue. Story 91. We could start electing younger people instead of octogenarians. Story 92. Does not really matter if the public is not getting the real results. Story 93. Any test that can produce subjective results will inevitably be used against someone toward whom the test giver is biased. This includes the politician you believe is the best candidate. Story 94. I am in favor of this. In addition, there should be an age limit. No one over 70. Story 95. How about not putting elderly people in the running for the office? Story 96. I am not opposed to testing, but many tests are biased. We need a way to mitigate those biases. Story 97. I fully support this for not only the President of the United States, but for all elected officials over the age of 65. Story 98. I strongly support this. Candidates should take a standardized test on the principles of the Constitution before running, before debates, and once every year in office. All results should be made public and completed in pencil, so candidates must write their answers themselves. Story 99. It would be a great idea to have candidates do that before the election, but what is the point of having a sitting president do it? Is it only so other countries can back it up with data when they make fun of us? Story 100. My main concern is who makes and grades the test. Otherwise, it is just performative. Also, if there is a table etiquette portion, such as which fork is for salads, that unfairly benefits wealthy Anglo-Saxons. Story 101. The blatantly false doctor's reports are entertaining, but playing devil's advocate. I can see how it is a matter of national security to project that the president is healthy. Do you really, as a country, want to broadcast that the leadership will be in crisis shortly because of recurring strokes? I do not agree, but I can see the argument. Should candidates take cognitive tests prior to running? Absolutely, if we can ensure the process is nonpartisan. I would argue a better move would be to require every voter to watch a random 20 minutes of a candidate speaking, unedited and not sanitized or spun by the media. Just the candidates explaining their positions. It might surprise some people. Story 102. How about implementing age limits for the presidency so we do not have people older than oil running the country? Story 103. I want this for every public office, every executive position, every job, and every civilian. Story 104. I think all high-level public servants should be required to do the following. 1. Make their tax information and investments public. This includes any business interests and investments that they, their families, or any holding company they control have. 2. Make a basic, recent health record available. Not detailed medical records, just enough to reassure the public that they can fulfill their roles. 3. Make a basic education history available. Not detailed transcripts, but verification of what schools they attended, what degrees they hold, and ideally the grade they received in civics classes. 4. Provide a complete and detailed list of all campaign contributions, including gifts and travel. 5. After a predetermined age, provide proof of cognitive and physical ability to perform their job. Some of this information is available, but it is not readily accessible. Story 105. That makes sense. If this person is representing us to the rest of the world, I would want to make sure that they are mentally fit for an elected position. Story 106. Crucially, we seem to elect only geriatric nursing home patients to positions of authority. Story 107. We have a mechanism for deciding who is qualified to be president. Candidates must be at least 35 years old and win a majority of electoral college votes. If you think that is a low bar, try running for office. Story 108. Testing should be conducted before anyone is allowed to announce their candidacy. Candidates must pass literacy testing and the standard citizenship tests on the Constitution and American history. Physical, cognitive, and mental health evaluations should be completed before campaigning. Story 109. This is essential. The study must be conducted by a third party rather than the president's cabinet, and the results must be made public. Story 110. It should not be just cognitive. Individuals should be required to take competency tests. Story 111. I think this is a great idea, and I have a list of the first people. Story 112. What if this had been suggested during the last administration? The phrase sharp as ever was used a lot until it was not. Story 113. Office holders should be required to pass an 8th grade equivalency test before taking office. Donald Trump would not have become president. Story 114. I am not an American. I understand the appeal of the idea, but it is easy to design cognitive tests that can be interpreted to produce any desired result. If I could make a single change that would instantly improve the pool of qualified candidates for President of the United States, I would add an upper age limit to the clause. That requires candidates to be at least 35 years old. I might even set the upper age limit as low as 65, which may seem young in today's society. If you elect a first-term president of the United States at 65 and they serve 2 full terms, they would be 73 years old at the end of the second term. Story 115. I am okay with an in-depth psychological evaluation to identify psychopaths, malignant narcissists, and similar individuals. Story 116. The public results would most certainly be modified to support the individual president. Story 117. Conducted by a bipartisan, nonpartisan panel. At least 5 doctors, preferably in person. The presidential propaganda machine cannot be trusted. Trump's was the worst, but I do not think Biden's was transparent either. Administer a cognitive test and a competency test once a year. Story 118. The real-time cognitive test is the job itself. Managing complex, contradictory information for 16 hours a day and leading the free world. Story 119. Very important. When someone plays diplomatic games, maintains a very public social media presence, and has their finger on the nuclear weapons button, it is absolutely critical that they be cognitively healthy. Story 120. That's the idea. It may not even be needed. It's insanity, but here we are. Story 121. It is not needed and can be easily abused. I do not need a test to know that the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces has clearly been dealing with dementia and other cognitive health declines since January 2017. Story 122. In theory, it sounds like a good idea to keep people who should be on their way to a peaceful retirement or to a nursing home out of powerful positions. In practice, I am not sure how it could be kept free of corruption and of bias favoring the side in power when implemented. Story 123. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, right? Story 124. We should hire people who are of the required age, not senior citizens. Story 125. It depends on the tests. The tests Trump took during his last term looked like something from Dr. Seuss. It would be better if he took something more demanding. Story 126. They should live in a world where the results are truthful and honest, instead of claims that our God King is in perfect health all the time. Story 127. It should have started with Reagan. Then, after every election, if they were re-elected, they should have to take another one. Story 128. I want the test made public, not just the results posted. With artificial intelligence rampant, I want nonpartisan witnesses present. Story 129. I do not think the results should simply be made public. The test should be administered publicly. Story 130. The presidents or leaders of democratic countries are a faithful reflection of their societies. Their cognitive capacity has nothing to do with it. Story 131. I would support requiring everyone who makes life or death decisions to take periodic cognitive tests, provided they are administered diligently, fairly, and honestly. Story 132. The issue with any form of cognitive or civics testing as a barrier to holding office or voting is that someone has to write, administer, and grade the test. These measures are not divinely ordained. Government officials or third-party contractors hired by them, whether elected or appointed, would need to create, administer, and score the examination. Presumably, you are suggesting this could have disqualified Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or both from contention for the United States presidency. If this policy were put in place now, would it not be written and administered by some combination of Trump appointees, and Republican members of Congress during the next election? If the Trump administration and current Republicans tried to implement such a test before the 2028 election, would you trust it to be a fair barrier to the presidency? If your preferred candidate were barred from running for president by a cognitive test implemented under the Trump administration, would you accept that as legitimate? If Donald Trump passed a cognitive test implemented during his own administration, would you suddenly stop believing he is unfit for the presidency? Can you honestly say it would be significantly more fair if written and administered by the Biden administration or the next Democratic administration? Maybe slightly, but would Republican voters accept that result as legitimate? Not a chance. Story 133. There should be a fitness for duty physical conducted once a year for anyone over the age of 72 and twice a year at age 76. People are living longer, healthier lives, including those who reach the White House, but a healthy body does not always mean a healthy brain. Story 134. Age limits are the best way to go. Term limits are already in place, but the idea that octogenarians should be running the country is insane. They have little stake in the country's long-term direction. Story 135. Yes. Also, to complete the trifecta, require a civics exam similar to the one postal employees take and a citizenship exam like the one given to immigrants applying for citizenship. This should be the bare minimum, in addition to a reasonable health exam to screen for cancers and other conditions. Federal Bureau of Investigation and Internal Revenue Service background checks on sources of income and creditors probably would not hurt either. Story 136. Did we not discuss this under the previous president? The people who thought it was a bad idea then now think it is a good idea. Story 137. I think any local, state, or federal elected official making more than $150,000 per year should have a public health report. Story 138. Only if every single public servant in high office does the same. Story 139. I find it strange that the current president keeps treating these as intelligence tests and challenges smart young people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to take the test to see if they can beat him. I enjoyed when she asked whether he had drawn a clock. Story 140. You do not need cognitive tests to decide not to vote for an 80-year-old senile man who is unable to make coherent sentences during debates. Story 141. This should be one part of a three-part test. 1. Cognitive test. 2. Cooking test, can be indoor or outdoor. 3. Arm wrestling. Story 142. All members of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches shall undergo mental and physical examinations conducted by randomly selected doctors. The examinations shall be observed and the results published by a randomly selected independent panel. A baseline will be set for each examination. Falling below, it will result in termination of employment. Story 143. As this example has shown, it is easy to find a medical professional who will lie about the results. Story 144. Honesty, integrity, respect, intelligence, compassion, and commitment would be nice to know. Story 145. Sure, I would require them to perform a physical task, such as climbing stairs to board an airplane within a set time. Story 146. I want a reality television show in which small teams compete in cognitive challenges. Story 147. Presidents like the current one would release fake results. Story 148. The entire campaigning process is a cognitive test. Story 149. I discussed this with a friend last night. We agreed it should occur during the campaign and apply to anyone running for any federal office. We also thought that if the president were required to undergo it during their term, the results would be falsified to preserve the country's image, regardless of which party held office. Story 150. Yes. And before Make America Great Again whataboutism, mandatory cognitive exams should apply to all presidential candidates, including Biden, Obama, Bush, Clinton, and Trump. Political party affiliation be damned. Story 151. It is not that we are doing this that is the problem. It is that we now live in a world where this is necessary. We never needed this before, especially in the United States. Given what the country has become, it is unfortunate that we need it. Story 152. It's the voters who should be taking the cognitive test. Story 153. Presidents should be required to undergo a full physical examination, including cognitive testing and a mental health evaluation performed by an independent committee with full oversight. The tests should be repeated annually or more frequently if deemed appropriate. The same requirement should apply to all senior members of government. I am not asserting that the current president has a medical problem, but having cared for patients with dementia, I observe many similarities between the way he speaks and the way they spoke. Story 154. I think every major political candidate should be evaluated on cognitive, constitutional, and ethical grounds. Those scores should be published on the ballot alongside the candidates' names so voters who are not familiar with them have information to make an educated choice. Story 155. Not just presidents, everyone. Politicians' medical records are made public, and private citizens would have access to similar information to help identify potential health issues as they age so they can receive appropriate care. Story 156. Are we talking about presidents or presidential candidates? We should determine whether they are unfit to run before the election, or simply cap the maximum age for candidates at 65. Story 157. Any such tests would simply be abused. It is a poll tax applied to the candidate. Let the people choose. The electorate and the Electoral College are the great filter. Story 158. They will cheat. It does not matter who they are or which party they belong to. Presidents have never been transparent about their health issues. Story 159. Surely this isn't necessary. What kind of electorate would vote for an idiot anyway? After all, we require them to display their wit and rhetorical prowess via a series of rigorous nationally televised debates. We can all adequately evaluate our candidates' intelligence without the help of any silly test. Story 160. Do not limit this to presidents. Everyone in office should be able to prove their sanity. Story 161. Why stop at presidents when we could include every elected official? Story 162. Relevant XKCD. Story 163. The entire testing and evaluation process should be broadcast. Story 164. You all voted for a known criminal and pedophile, as if knowing he was an incompetent idiot would have changed anything. If more than 7 out of 10 American voters can see a criminal, an impeached official, a known pedophile, and an accused rapist promising to destroy what is left of our democracy and still decide not to vote against that, then nothing matters. Story 165. After a certain age, all elected officials should have to take a cognitive test. If they fail, they should not be allowed to run for or remain in office. Story 166. The problem with tests and requirements is that they can be used as a political weapon. For example, not allowing felons to run for president sounds sensible until it is used in prosecutions to remove rivals. There are several safeguards that already exist. First, people can choose not to vote for someone they suspect is cognitively impaired. Second, the founders instituted the Electoral College to provide an intermediary body in case the general public tried to elect an obvious incompetent. Third, unfit presidents can be removed by impeachment or by the 25th Amendment. The problem is not that safeguards do not exist. The problem is that our Constitution is broken and needs to be replaced with something more functional. Story 167. You who keep proposing this do not understand that it is the people's responsibility to elect the leaders they want to see. You cannot abdicate that to a test or a formalistic restriction. Story 168. I don't think it would matter because the results would lack validity. If the government decided it needed the president and the cabinet to win a National Football League match against the highest-rated team, the results would show that the president's team would win by a never-before-seen landslide, 150-3. Story 169. Since older adults must take a vision test to renew a driver's license, requiring a cognitive test for those who wish to continue running the country seems reasonable. Story 170. It is a nice thought, but the horses have bolted. Also, right-wing people would rather have a sundowning rapist in office than a liberal of any description. They would rather see minorities suffer than have anything good happen anywhere in the country. How many Make America Great Again morons regret electing that fucking rat Trump to a second term? A bunch, sure. Millions do not. Story 171. It should happen before they register to run. We should also cap presidential campaigns at 50 or 60. Story 172. Forget making the results public. I want the test recorded on camera so I can see that the person I'm about to vote for does not take more than 2 seconds to identify an elephant or a giraffe. I also want to see how long it actually takes them to draw the hands on a clock. For some reason, I think it took Trump far too long to get his perfect score on a test that a person with normal brain function could complete in minutes. Story 173. It would be easier to have an upper age limit tied to the retirement age, since they keep wanting to raise it anyway. Story 174. I think if they are at the point they need them regularly, they should not be in the office. Story 175. I've got one better than that. The president, the vice president, or any member of Congress cannot be above the retirement age. We cannot have our leaders yearning for the good old days of the 1950s. Story 176. It would not matter. Voters largely do not care about these results. Story 177. We should be doing it for elderly drivers, let alone for the people running the country. Story 178. Only if the voters are the ones doing the grading. Give them the test, publish their answers, and let the voters decide what to do with that information. Anything else risks the test administrators taking agency away from the voters. Story 179. We need stricter tests than simply ensuring they are not completely gone. Story 180. I think that all presidential candidates should have to take intelligence quotient tests, cognitive tests, and behavioral tests to be on the ballot. Story 181. I think every elected public official at the state and federal level should have a baseline established at the beginning of their first term. For state legislative and judicial officials, the test should be required every 5 years, with the results made public shortly thereafter and compared to the baseline. For federal legislative and judicial officials and for state governors and lieutenant governors, the test should be required every year. For the president and the vice president, the test should be required every 6 months. Story 182. I favor it, but they should also pass, with high marks, a test on the United States Constitution and be able to recite a reasonable approximation of the oath of office without prompting. Story 183. If I were occupying the White House as the nation's most powerful official, which I am not, I would want to be removed from the position if my cognitive function declines so dramatically that I could not perform adequately. Should that not be a common policy among nations? An organization that does not have such a policy may one day be seen as abusive and dysfunctional. Why would we want a malfunctioning organization? Policies could be more rigorous and include age-related assessments where cognitive decline is more likely due to reduced neuroplasticity. Maybe one day, if medicine becomes advanced enough to restore cognitive function, there will be no need for cognitive function tests. Intelligence quotient tests would, begrudgingly, become more relevant. For the record, I dislike intelligence quotient tests more than cognitive function tests. If someone can learn the answers in advance, does an intelligence quotient test measure intellect? Or does it measure knowledge and recall? I admit recall is relevant, but it does not, to me, constitute a legitimate intelligence quotient. I think of puzzles like fitting shapes into holes rather than abstract symbolic problems. Either way, we are limited in the moment and can only act to bring about change, which requires coordination and communication. Tomorrow may be the day to wait, but today is the day to act. Story 184. Unpopular opinion. I am against it because it contradicts the democratic process. A key principle is that anyone can run for office, and voters decide what matters to them. If this information is vital, voters will pressure their candidates to release it. In modern politics, candidates in most developed countries interact extensively during campaigns. In the United States of America, this is especially true, since campaigns are among the longest in the world, so voters generally get to know who they are voting for. Story 185. Wouldn't you want the pilot of your next transcontinental flight to do the same? Story 186. It is good in theory, but it could be abused by those in power who fix the tests to disqualify their opponents as not mentally healthy enough. Story 187. America cannot be trusted in any capacity to have legitimate testing in this regard. The pedophile president over there right now has people convinced that he isn't a fat, doughy, disgusting pile of fuck. Story 188. Candidates and elected officials should be required to take cognitive tests, especially if they are over 65 or have had a brain injury. Dianne Feinstein was clearly unable to serve her last term, yet her staff presented her to cast votes with her party. The same applies to Mitch McConnell. Such officials should retire before they embarrass themselves and their constituents. Story 189. I am against it. We just need to stop electing ancient people. Story 190. If competency tests are used, they can be defined to measure anything such as religious belief or morals, which could be dangerous. I urge everyone to download and read the Montreal Cognitive Assessment that Donald Trump said was so hard. If a doctor suggests you take the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, it is usually because they are concerned you are not competent to live alone without risking incidents like burning your house down or getting lost in your own neighborhood. The Montreal Cognitive Assessment is not for measuring cognitive decline but for assessing cognitive competence for independent living. It sets a low threshold, and passing it does not mean someone is competent to make decisions for others. Story 191. If you hold an elected office, everyone should know everything about you. Story 192. I said it when Joe Biden was in office, and I will repeat it with Donald Trump. Story 193. Public? No. To an independent medical review board that releases a public report. Absolutely. The public has no business reviewing medical tests for anyone. Story 194. That's not why. He has dementia. His father and grandfather both died from it. Story 195. The election is the test. We do not need extra tests. Elections must produce better results for both the presidency and Congress. Ditch first past the post voting and adopt ranked choice voting, score then automatic runoff voting, or another ordinal or cardinal system combined with proportional representation. The problem is the stability of the two-party hegemony. I will probably never vote Republican, not after George W. Bush, and certainly not since the Tea Party took over the party. In the current American system, I can only ever vote for one party. The 2000 election was the first I was eligible to vote in. Since then, I have had to vote Democratic in every election, even though I found very little to like in John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, or Joe Biden, because they were not trying to provoke a cultural struggle. In the current system, a third-party vote is the same as not voting. If an electoral system for the whole government, not just the presidency, can make more than two parties viable at a given time, it is better than the current United States system. The United States has had a stable two-party system since 1796. The composition of those parties changed 3 times, in 1828, 1836, and 1856. This system naturally results in voting for the lesser of two evils every time. Fix that, and we do not need cognitive tests, age limits, or other unnecessary measures. Viable candidates will be better. We will no longer be reduced to choosing which of two primary winners we dislike less. Story 196. It makes sense when the president is old, but he does not seem to have problems in that area. Story 197. It is time to put an age cap on the office and mandate retirement. Story 198. When it is completely obvious that something is wrong, they should be required to undergo cognitive testing and the results should be made public. They should not pick and choose what the public is allowed to know. There is no way the current president would pass cognitive testing and score perfect scores. Story 199. Do you really think they would give us the real results? Trump's doctor already said he is the healthiest president ever. The cognitive test would be the same nonsense. Story 200. If we stop electing older people, I do not think we will have this issue. Story 201. Love the idea. Biden would have been found out years earlier, and Trump would not have been allowed to run. Story 202. Yes, no one over 65. A referendum can be held to recall the president. Story 203. It does not matter if they are not forced to do it. As we can see right now, if there are no actual safeguards, a president can become a king if they are brazen enough and have the silent support of those who should be doing their duty to the country and the Constitution, which they all swore to uphold. Ah well. Story 204. I like it, but a maximum age feels like a simpler solution. Story 205. It is a really bad idea. The mental health and capacity of the president are important for national security. Story 206. I have been for it since Reagan spent 2 years raking leaves in his pool. Story 207. There was a constitutional and government exam, perhaps the same one students in my high school and state had to pass before we could graduate. This was in the 1960s. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.